In this lecture, we're going to examine what is known as the Battle of Britain, or the German air campaign against Great Britain in 1940. This was part of a larger scheme by Hitler to invade and conquer Britain. This would have been the air offensive that led up to what was known as Operation Sea Lion, and a plan to invade Britain from northern France. The battle itself began in June of 1940, but the real air war didn't really start until mid-August of 1940. This was the British Royal Air Force, or RAF, versus the Luftwaffe. It began with Luftwaffe attacks against radar stations and airfields. This battle, by the way, was the first major campaign to be fought almost entirely by air forces. Hitler's objectives were fairly simple initially: to focus on military targets, to take out the British ability to resupply its armies, and to attack port facilities. This would be a run-up to, again, that Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Ostensibly, Hitler believed that the air campaign would break the British will, that an invasion might not even be necessary if he could get the British to capitulate. And eventually he wanted, more than anything else, to get a settled peace with the British. Here's a quote from Hitler: "Where Napoleon failed, I shall succeed. I shall land on the shores of Britain." Napoleon also dreamed of an invasion of Great Britain, never actually got around to it in the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century. The decision to take on Britain was fairly simple. He believed, Hitler that is, Britain was the last threat to him in the West. Certainly he prized Great Britain's industrial and commercial capabilities. He considered the English to be, in his distorted view of racial hierarchy, to be just below the Germans, and he really held out hope that Great Britain and Germany would unite and take on the Soviet Union. He underestimated British anti-communist sentiments, and he believed they had a much greater enemy in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately for Hitler, he also underestimated British will and British ability to resupply itself. At the time of the Battle of Britain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain was Winston Churchill. He had a lengthy political career that started in 1900, ended in 1964, in and out of power, in favor a few times. Fairly well versed in military matters, had served during the Boer War in South Africa. Two key figures leading the Battle of Britain: on the British side, Hugh Dowding, described by one of his contemporaries as a difficult man, a self-opinionated man, a most determined man, and yet a man who knew more than anybody else about all aspects of aerial warfare. Very arrogant, but a brilliant leader. Before becoming the head of the British Fighter Command, he was in charge of supply and research for the Royal Air Force, and a very early proponent of radar. On the opposite side, Hermann Goering, a World War I flying ace and an early member of the Nazi Party, one of Hitler's closest confidants. He was not a stupid man, but certainly was not a brilliant military theorist by any stretch. He took no interest in new technology and typically saw air combat merely in terms of shooting down as many as possible of enemy planes. Numbers really impressed him. Goering's concept of command and his approach to the Battle of Britain were rather crude by military standards. One of his contemporaries said, "The German Air Force, lacking any clear objective from Goering, almost bled to death as a result of the Battle of Britain." In what became known as Spitfire Summer, The battle was fought over skies in southern England. Spitfire battles, or battles between fighters. In June and July, the Germans attacked convoys off the south coast ports, the English ports of Dover and Plymouth. And though outnumbered at the beginning of the battle, the British had one significant advantage, which was radar. They had the most advanced warning system in the world at that point. And the British were able to prepare fighter planes in time to fight off German attackers, a very important advantage early in the Battle of Britain. Here you can see on this map the location of significant radar installations and bases. The dashed lines show the range of the low-level British radar, which skirted the coast of France. The long-range or higher-level radar traveled well into coastal France and gave the British significant information about incoming German attacks. Here's a picture of a what was called the chain home radar system, or one particular unit on a 185-foot tower. Here's a quote from Winston Churchill on the chain home system. "All the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless but for this system. It fused together a most elaborate instrument of war, the like of which existed nowhere in the world." In addition to the radar system, the British employed a legion of spotters who were able to more closely direct anti-aircraft support and alert military leaders about incoming planes and their direction. The battle intensified in August of 1940. This is where the real air war begins. Some very terrifying air battles in this particular month. And you can see from the PowerPoint slide that the pace of attacks began accelerating significantly. In this month, the RAF lost over 100 fighters. Germany, however, lost more than 190 planes during this month. This is an image of tracer fire from a Spitfire hitting a German airplane. In terms of the number of single-seat fighters, you can see that the British maintained, after an early disadvantage, a significant advantage in the number of fighters they were able to field at any one time. And the British were able to quickly resupply at least at a much faster rate than the Germans, their air force. They also had a distinct advantage in their ability to get damaged planes back in the air, and maintained a significant advantage over the Germans in their mechanical abilities. Finally, in terms of the number of pilots, the British had a tremendous advantage over the Germans. It's one thing to have a plane available for an attack. It's quite another to have an experienced pilot. And the British much more successful at resupplying the number of pilots to fly the aircraft. The Germans, of course, at this time are fighting wars on multiple fronts and are not able to resupply experienced pilots at the rate that the British can. The Germans changed plans a little bit in September of 1940. Hitler became enraged at the targeting of German industrial areas by the British, and instead of focusing on military and infrastructure, Hitler directed the attacks on British cities. By the end of this month, September of 1940, the Germans had lost 600 aircraft. And unfortunately for Hitler, at this point, the radar system of the British had degraded significantly. Had he continued on this path, he might have been able to completely destroy the radar system, but he changed focus and began targeting cities. On September 7th of 1940, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to begin bombing British cities. The fighter command was almost crushed at this point. Pilots were exhausted. The British endured some of the heaviest losses. But unfortunately for Hitler, again, this shift toward targeting cities gave the RAF some breathing room and allowed it to recover. And while the civilian tolls were significant during this phase of the Battle of Britain, the ability for the RAF to begin resupplying and retooling and gearing back up was a much-needed break, and Hitler inadvertently helped the British at this point. Germany attacked with over 1,000 aircraft on September 15th. This was probably the biggest day of the battle in terms of casualties and shock value of the Battle of Britain. Very, very heavy fighting. Later this became commemorated as the Battle of Britain Day. Interestingly, the propaganda machines were both in high gear for the British and the Germans. The RAF claimed to have shot down 175 aircraft at this time, but the later analyses suggest maybe 56 destroyed in this day. These and similar numbers were promoted by the Germans, claiming damage that didn't happen. These inflated numbers were accepted at the time. Both sides really fighting a propaganda war as much as they were fighting a military war. The attacks did cause widespread damage and loss of life. And unfortunately for the Germans, their bombers were being shot down faster than they could be manufactured. Hitler needed summer weather for his planned invasion, so as winter approached, the threat of the invasion receded. So the role of the colder British winter played a war in winding down this battle, and the pointlessness of the campaign began to sink in gradually with Hitler. The Ultra campaign, or the ability of the British to decrypt German signal traffic, was just beginning to have some positive benefits. The British were aware of Goering's order of battle, but they were not able to decipher the daily strength of the squadrons. It gave some lead on when bombing missions were going to run, but not the exact details of the timing. At this point, the situation was moving so fast it was hard to use decrypts for tactical decisions, but it did provide some, particularly in terms of air raid alerts, provide some measure of comfort, I guess, to civilians. A brief rundown of some of the major aircraft at that time. The Henkel 111 was kind of a slow, lumbering, and easy to shoot down bomber. It also, one of the disadvantages was it had a relatively small bomb load. The Messerschmitt 109 was, and the 110 were the most dangerous, I would say, German aircraft at this time, especially in terms of cannon. Very popular with pilots. They were plagued, however, by armament problems and had a significant problem with redesigns, many redesigns, and training issues associated with frequent redesigns of the aircraft. The Stuka dive bomber was in some ways was a terror weapon, and if you look up online, perhaps on YouTube, just type in Stuka and siren or whistle. It had a very distinctive sound. They attached these whistles to the plane that made a terrifying noise as they began their dive toward civilian or military targets. Principal British aircraft of significance here, the Supermarine Spitfire was one of the most deadly British fighters. It was equipped with 8 guns and held its own very well with the British fighters at the time. The bombers were much less used in this particular campaign. There were some bombing raids, again, of major German cities, mostly as a show of force and a way to reassure the British citizens that the RAF would pay retribution on German cities as well. The failure of this air campaign against England can be chalked up to a number of reasons. First and foremost, Hitler failed to establish air superiority. And through attrition, aircraft were lost and weren't able to be replaced by German production fast enough. And the British had a distinct advantage in their ability to resupply and rearm themselves. The fleet of invasion barges that was assembled in French ports for Operation Sea Lion was heavily destroyed in RAF bomber attacks. During 1940, British aircraft production overtook the Germans, and they never looked back from that point forward in terms of production. During the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe received far fewer fighter aircraft than fighter command. And certainly the role of radar can't be underestimated in the failure of the Battle of Britain, or for the Germans to win the Battle of Britain. This slide gives you some statistics on the number of aircrew killed, the POWs, the aircraft destroyed. You can see in military terms, the Germans suffered far higher losses, but in civilian terms, the British suffered significantly higher losses. As a result of the failed invasion of Britain and the failed air campaign, the Germans, who had seemed invincible prior to this battle, were no longer seen this way. The British received a tremendous morale boost as a result of this defeat, or at least prevention of the Germans from invading Britain. Britain would now have time to rebuild its armed forces and get ready for launching future attacks against the Germans. As a result of the air campaign against Great Britain, American public opinion, which had been rather isolationist, began to drift toward supporting a war. And at this time, Hitler began to look elsewhere, specifically the Soviet Union, for expansion.